and moved to the wild, where I could scream and nobody would hear. Nobody. Only you.
Early on the morning of December 21st, 2010, an inmate known as Patient 28 disappeared from her cell at Sabbath Day Asylum.
Where I could scream and nobody would hear.
I was her doctor. This is my confession. Patient 28 was registered into Sabbath Day Asylum in June of 2004. She was catatonic on arrival, unresponsive to external stimuli. What records we received indicated our Jane Doe was 33 years old. She was an unknown identity, it appears, by design. In addition to having no name, Patient 28 didn't have any fingerprints. The tips of her fingers are smooth. She wasn't mutilated. Patient 28 was born this way. What records we received of Patient 28 came included in a box. A post-it note on a photo, paperclip to 2 letters and 3 checks. The first letter was signed by B. Grin Esquire and instructed Sabbath Day to cash the first check immediately. It was enough money to cover 7 years of care for Patient 28 at a generous rate of inflation. The second check was a donation to Sabbath Day, enough money to cover 10 7-year stays at a generous rate of inflation. But that check was postdated January 1st, 2011, as was the third check, but this one was made payable to me. The instructions were explicit. Patient 28's stay at Sabbath Day Asylum was contingent upon me, the managing physician, caring for and treating her. At the time, I didn't realize I knew her. The second letter was a handwritten note from Patient 28. It was written only 6 months prior.
To whom it may concern. When I was 16, I noticed a flutter centralized under the right side of my skull. Reoccurrences were rare, so I ignored the problem. But as the years progressed, the flutters began to throb, and the throbs began to ache. I only sought medical attention after the migraines in frequency intensified, and over-the-counter medication stopped working. Countless tests were conducted, but results came back inconclusive, or worse yet, ideal for a healthy young woman in her 20s like me. My suffering, professionals led me to believe, was psychosomatic. My imagination. Prescription drugs offered some relief for a few years, but by the time I was 30, even they became ineffective. What was once a flutter now felt, at worst, like a jagged rock bludgeoning my skull. I contemplated suicide, but never acted. Instead, I chose to travel my path alone. I withdrew from society and moved to the wild, where I could scream and nobody would hear. Tonight is my reprieve. Before dawn, I will surrender. Only you can save me, whoever you are.
After first reading her letter, I looked deep into patient 28's eyes and searched for the woman trapped inside. No one was staring back at me. The contrast between the colorful woman in the photo and the muted remains wheeled into Sabbath Day were stark. I believed at the time that the woman in the photo and letter was gone. There was no one left to save. I was wrong. Out of all the content in the envelope that arrived with patient 28 on that first day, it was the post-it that intrigued me the most. When I was 7, I was hospitalized with scarlet fever. My temperature hovered between 104 and 105 degrees. I was asleep most of the time, although always in a haze. The nurses left on a TV to keep me company, which led to a series of imaginary news stories. At the time, the hallucination seemed very real. News first broke during the Showcase Showdown. When I opened my eyes, I found a befuddled Walter Cronkite staring at me through the TV. He paused for a moment, blinked, and looked up at the camera, and then back down at the paper in his hands. But after what seemed an eternity, he finally announced, "I am being told by producers that what I am about to tell you has been verified by multiple sources. Although I should disclose, I'm not quite sure what it is I am telling you." Across the country, penguins appear to be escaping from zoos and aquariums in droves. In San Francisco, Chicago, and New York, gangs of underground penguins have emerged from the sewers and are terrorizing local residents as I speak. But this exodus is not exclusive to the cities. Secret clusters of penguins are popping up across the country in barns and caves. What is even more baffling is that the penguins appear to be en route, destined for Washington, D.C. Before once again giving in to my fever and falling back asleep, I smiled at the footage of penguins waddling along the interstate, sliding down the baggage carousels, and pacing impatiently on subway platforms. Although I was only 7, as I drifted away that day, I remember thinking to myself, "Give 'em hell. Stand tall. Penguins unite." When I awoke the next day, my hallucinations were in overdrive. I believe it was Walter Cronkite himself who first proclaimed it the Million Bird March. Penguins had overtaken the National Mall in Washington, D.C. 12 lines formed around the reflecting pool. Mr. Cronkite noted how each bird paused for exactly 3 seconds before diving in. While watching the footage, he wondered aloud, "What do penguins thank God for?" I thought it was a good question. Behind closed doors, President Carter met with the Penguin Council, a group of especially squawky representatives from around the country. While few details were provided to the press, Walter Cronkite disclosed that President Carter agreed to assign an ambassador to the penguins. This penguin ambassador, chosen unanimously by the council, would be critical in bridging the divide between man and bird. Flesh and feather. Penguins unite. What do penguins thank God for? Later that night, the mood was notably somber. The penguins were motionless, facing the reflecting pool with their beaks lowered. Only when the moon began to rise did the penguins slowly lift their heads and spread their wings. It was a long process, but when the moon climaxed in the crisp, starlit sky that cold December night, it was a moment, Walter Cronkite recounted, when the nation's collective jaw dropped and the penguins took flight. However miraculous, the launching penguins were anything but graceful. The chubby birds collided with each other awkwardly and bobbed away on the northern horizon. But once each bird had enough space to flounder without threatening another, the penguins formed a united, leaderless front and headed northeast over Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City. I fought not to sleep that night. I didn't want to miss the penguins flying over New England, and was naturally curious to see who was selected to be the lucky ambassador. I also worried, what if, by some off chance, the penguins were looking for me? Did they know that I was in the hospital? Could they even find the tiny village of Sabbath Day Asylum? The thought of missing out on such an honor made me defiant, and for the first time in 3 days, my feet touched the ground. If penguins could defy gravity, surely I could open a window. I'll never forget how disenchanted I was when I realized that the flight of penguins had been only a dream. I had so wanted to live in a world where Walter Cronkite could be rendered speechless, and where penguins could fly. When I returned home from the hospital, my outlook improved. My bedroom was freezing and dusted in snow. Perched on my sill before an open window, a lone penguin waited for me. I reached for the card lassoed around the stuffed animal's neck and read the handwritten note inside. The same words I'd later find scribbled on a post-it, sticking to a photo of patient 28. Open your heart to the impossible, and the mind will follow.